I learned the truth about why my bride vanished on our wedding day from a man who shared my eyes and a woman who no longer remembered my name. By the time I put the pieces together, 30 years had gone by. A DNA test had introduced me to my own son, and the person who paid her to run had been buried for 2 winters. Hey there, folks. It's Hank from Mind-Blowing Stories, coming to you from my garage-turned studio with the squeaky stool and the dented Miller Lite sign I still haven't hung straight. Before we dive in, do me a favor. I checked my stats this morning, and about 96% of you who watch these videos aren't subscribed. That stings more than my first hip replacement. Hit that button, give me a like, and drop a comment about where you're listening from. I read them all. This one's personal. It's a love story, yes, but it's also a mess of mistakes and secrets, and a few turns I never saw coming. If you stick around to the end, I'll tell you how I finally said goodbye. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a 2-bedroom ranch with aluminum siding and a driveway that puddled whenever it rained. My old man, Gus, ran a little home repair outfit and drank his coffee like it had insulted him. My mother, Caroline, taught 2nd grade and kept the good towels for company we never had. We weren't poor, but money didn't exactly pull up a chair either. I was a lineman for Dayton Power and Light by 20, and by 22, I was a foreman. The work was simple and honest. You climb, you fix, you come down. Electricity doesn't care if you had a bad night. I met Claire on a July evening in 1981 at a bowling alley called All-Star Lanes. She was behind the counter, handing out shoes and rolling her eyes at the guys who thought they were clever. The first time she looked up at me, it felt like I'd walked into a room with the lights already on. She had a short brown bob that never stayed where she brushed it, strong shoulders from waitressing, and a way of listening that made you straighten your posture mid-sentence. She said her last name was Whitman, and she was saving up for night classes at Sinclair Community College. I told her I was saving up for a pickup I couldn't afford. She laughed and gave me lane 7, because she said 7 was lucky for people who didn't believe in luck. We bowled, by which I mean I rolled gutter balls and tried to look charming. After I turned in the ugly shoes, I asked if she ever got out of there before midnight. She said, "Not if you ask like that." I apologized. I told her I was better at electricity than conversation. That got me her shift schedule. I came back on her day off, and we went to Frisch's for strawberry pie and coffee that could strip paint. I talked about climbing poles in storms, and she talked about her brother in Atlanta who sent postcards that smelled like orange peels. She had a way of speaking that turned the small things big. The first night we kissed, we stood in the parking lot under a flickering streetlight, and she said, "Don't write me poetry, Hank. Just show up and be decent." That was her kind of romance. Show up, be decent. We were that kind of simple for a while. Sunday drives in my rusted Chevy, swimming at Eastwood Lake with towels that smelled like sun. She'd come by my mother's place and peel potatoes, while Mom told stories about kids who tried to eat glue in class. My father would sit at the table with a ledger book and pretend not to notice the way we looked at each other. He wasn't a romantic, my old man. He approved of floors that didn't squeak and lawns cut so low the grass gave up. The idea of a feeling you couldn't tighten with a wrench bothered him. The first crack showed up in the form of a man named Eddie Knox. I knew Eddie from high school, one of those guys who graduated straight into the long life of a bad plan. He worked on cars in a garage that technically belonged to his uncle, but it was mostly a hangout for men with too much beer and not enough future. Eddie had been with Claire before me, back when her mother was sick and she thought stability and danger were the same thing if you just squared your shoulders. He came into All-Star Lanes one evening with that grin he used to wear like a dare. I was putting quarters on the pinball machine, and I heard her voice go flat behind me. "Eddie, you need to leave." He called her Daisy, which made my hands close into fists. He said, "I hear you're with the lineman now. You trading up or just slumming?" I told him he had 5 seconds to walk. He told me someone like her didn't belong to someone like me. And even though I hate to admit it, I swung first. We knocked into a rack of bowling balls, and for a second the world filled with noise that wasn't anger, just the dumb thud of spheres rolling loose. Eddie didn't throw many punches, but he was gifted at aiming what he had. He clipped me on the cheekbone hard enough to make my vision go plaid. The manager, a guy named Mo with forearms like hams, hauled us apart and threw Eddie out. As he left, Eddie looked at Claire, and he didn't smile. He gave her that other look, the one that takes inventory and subtracts. He said, "We're not done." It wasn't loud, but it was the kind of quiet that sticks. I wish I could tell you I didn't let that worm its way into our days. I wish I could say I trusted the strength in Claire's eyes and the steadiness of what we were building. But I'm honest on this channel. I got watchful. I started driving past the alley on nights I wasn't even there, just to make sure her car was out front. I picked fights over nothing and apologized over everything. She kept saying the same thing. "Hank, show up. Be decent." Easy instruction, right? Harder than electricity at midnight in the rain. The summer wore itself into September, and I knew if I didn't grab hold, I'd lose more than peace. So I bought a ring I couldn't really afford, the kind with a diamond that glinted just enough under fluorescent light. We drove out to a strip of field near Old Troy Pike, where planes coming in low to land over at the base looked like silver fish swimming through a purple sky. I told her I didn't have a poem. I had a promise. I said I would show up, even when it was hard, and I would be decent, even when it wasn't easy, and I would love her in exactly the shape of her life. She laughed and cried at the same time and said she hated diamonds but loved stupid men who meant it. She said yes. We decided on a small ceremony that October in the backyard at my parents' place because my mother had those azaleas and insisted they'd be beautiful, even if it was technically the wrong season. I asked Eddie to mind his own business by staying out of town. He told me over the phone, "There's no petition for what I want." He hung up. I heard the click in my ear like a hammer. The evening before the wedding, the sky went the color of a bruise, and rain started up heavy enough to make the gutters throw their hands up. My father and I worked under the awning to keep the folding chairs dry. He kept looking at me like he had sand in his eye. Halfway through, he said, "You sure? With him, that was a love song." I told him, "Yes, I'm sure." He nodded, stepped back, and went inside. I found out later that he made 2 phone calls that night. He never told me who they were to. Around 9, I drove to the little rental where Claire and her friend Beth were staying so they could get ready in the morning without my mother fussing. Beth opened the door, and I saw the way she kept her hand on the frame, like a brace. She said Claire had a headache and went to lie down. I stood in the doorway and told her I loved her. And through the closed bedroom door, Claire said the soft version of my name, the one you can only hear if you're the one being called. Hank. I went home and could not shut my eyes. The rain got louder until it felt like someone was pouring ball bearings on the roof. Morning came like it always does. Even when you don't want it. The rain stopped. The world smelled new, like cut cucumber and wet fence post. People showed up with casseroles and folding tables. The world's domestic army marching under the banner of potato salad. My mother fussed the azaleas into a sorrowful kind of dignity. Noon came. 1, 2. The pastor shifted from foot to foot like he had to use the restroom. My father kept checking his watch and walking to the end of the driveway. Beth pulled me aside at 3 and asked me to sit. I remember thinking, sit where? Sit how? She handed me a folded piece of paper. It was damp at the edges like it had been held in a sweaty palm. Hank, I'm sorry. Don't come looking for me. This is the best thing for you. Remember to show up and be decent. I love you. The last 3 words were smudged, but I could still hear them. I stood in the backyard in a borrowed suit with a boutonniere that smelled like soap, and I realized the rest of the day would happen to me whether I moved or not. I didn't cry. Not then. The crying came later. Stubborn. Like a stuck jar you open with a dish towel. People packed up folding chairs quietly. My mother hugged me like she was trying to press me back into childhood. My father put the note in his shirt pocket with an expression I couldn't read. He didn't say a thing. The sun went down like it had better places to be. That night I drove the streets like a lost dog until I ran out of gas near a liquor store with a busted neon sign. I walked home and slept on the couch like I didn't trust my bed with something as heavy as me. Now here's where I wish the story took one of those easy turns. It didn't. I called hospitals, bus stations, friends of friends. I put her name on little scraps of paper on corkboards in grocery stores, the way people try to find missing cats. For 3 months I looked, which I now realize is not the same as finding. One afternoon in January, I came home from a storm call-out and found a brown envelope on my front step with no stamp and no return address. Inside, there was $67 in cash and my ring, the same ring I dropped into her palm near the runway lights. No note, just the ring and the cash. Counted exactly, like whoever left it didn't know how to give me change for something that cost more than money. I didn't show my parents. I put the ring in the freezer behind a bag of peas. I don't know why. Maybe I thought cold could stop time. Life, that rude roommate, kept on. I worked. I ate the same 2 dinners. I slept like a man hiding from himself. After a year of that, the silence of what I didn't know started to feel louder than any answer I could get. You can only live under a question mark for so long before the hook starts to catch on everything. I packed my tools and took a job with a crew that did storm recovery out of state. I went where the weather went. Louisiana, the Carolinas, back up to Indiana. I climbed poles blistered by lightning and came down at dawn when the world looked bleached and harmless. I dated a little. A nurse in Lafayette who liked bad television and good bourbon. A teacher in Charleston who cried when she laughed. Nice women with lives that did not need excavating. I couldn't make myself go past 3 months. I always had to be somewhere. That was my excuse. Around 93, I got a call from my mother that my father's blood told its own story. She said it straight. Cancer. He fought it with that stubbornness he usually saved for floor joists. In his second winter of chemo, we sat in his garage on folding chairs, not looking at each other. He told me a story about a job where he fell through a ceiling and landed on a dining table set for Thanksgiving. He said the woman whose table it was looked at him like he'd arrived to carve the turkey. We laughed until he coughed. Then he got quiet in a way that felt like closing a door softly behind yourself. He said, "I did something I thought was right. It may not have been." The words hung there like laundry you forgot to bring in before the rain. He didn't say more. I should have forced the issue. I should have grabbed the sentence and shaken it until more words fell out. But his skin was gray and thin as paper, and his hands shook when he reached for the beer he shouldn't have, and I let him keep his silence. He died in February, 2 weeks after the groundhog and 2 months before the azaleas. Grief turns time into taffy. You either stretch with it or you snap. I went home after the funeral and cleaned out his desk because my mother couldn't bear to touch his things. I found 3 envelopes filled with receipts, a baggie of screws that didn't fit any household object, and a little metal key with teeth like a crooked smile. It didn't match any lock in the house. I kept it because I keep things I don't understand. Maybe that's the tone of this whole story. I keep things I don't understand. The next big jolt, the kind that picks you up and sets you down someplace you don't recognize, came decades after the backyard phantom wedding. It was 2017. I was 60, newly retired, the kind of man who watches the morning news with his shoes already on. My buddy Tim at the VFW had one of those DNA kits and wouldn't stop talking about the cousin in Oregon it found for him. My love life at that point was mostly old songs and the memory of a laugh in a bowling alley. I spat in the little tube because I was bored and curious and because sometimes you kick the mulch around and see what crawls. A month later, I got an email on a Sunday morning while the coffee pot wheezed. It said I had a close family match, 99 point something percent. It said the person was male and 35. Name, Mason Turner. I stared at the screen until the letters rearranged themselves into shapes that didn't make sense. I typed a message with my hands shaking so hard the key sounded like rain. I told him my name was Hank and if he wanted to talk, I was here. I told myself I was just gathering data, like storm reports. I told myself a lot of things. He wrote back 3 hours later. He lived 2 towns over in Beaver Creek. He had a wife named Jen and a toddler who liked to put plastic dinosaurs in their shoes. He worked at a plant that made whatever it is we all use that nobody thinks about. He said he was adopted. He had always loved bikes and the smell of rain, and he never thought that meant anything until he saw my face. He attached a photo. Folks, I put my coffee down and sat on the floor like the breath had been knocked out of me. He had my jaw and my father's worried eyebrows. He had that one front tooth that refuses to sit straight no matter what a dentist promises. I wrote back one sentence. Where did you come from? It was the wrong question, but it was the only one I had. We met at a diner off 35 with yellowed pictures of regulars on the walls. He walked in and I stood up, and it felt like a mirror had walked out of the bathroom and sat down across from me. He ordered pancakes and I ordered pancakes, and we both laughed without saying why. He told me his adoptive parents were good people who never made him feel like he was a draft version. He'd looked into his file because that's what you do when you start to wonder who you could blame for the shape of your nose. There was a name for his birth mother, Claire, no last name, just Claire. She'd put him up for adoption in late 1982 in Cincinnati. The agency notes said she was young and scared and certain. She left an envelope with a few things for him when he turned 21. A pressed flower, a bus ticket stub to Indianapolis, a note that read, "Always choose kindness when you can." He slid the note across the table. I recognized the tilt of the handwriting. I could have traced it with my finger from memory and not lifted the pencil once. I told him I thought I knew his mother. I tried to say it without shaking. I told him the story, and he listened like he was trying to hold water in his hands. He asked where she was now. I said I didn't know. We sat there while the waitress topped off our coffee 3 times and asked if we wanted anything that wasn't sugar on a plate. He said he wanted to know her. I said I wanted to know everything. I went home and dug through the old boxes I swore I'd never open. There was the ring in a little sandwich bag next to a bag of frozen blueberries. I took it out and set it on the table and felt like I'd put a live thing there that needed feeding. There was the brown envelope with $67, the damp edges now stiff with time. There was the note from the wedding day, the smudge of love you still readable if you squinted. I called my mother and told her I needed to ask her a question I should have asked 25 years earlier. She said she had been waiting. We sat at her kitchen table at twilight with the shades open in the evening, doing that thing where it forgives you for being alive. She told me my father had gotten a visit the night before the wedding. She'd been in the living room folding napkins when a man she didn't recognize knocked on the back door. She heard voices, low and urgent, the way men sound when they don't want your mother to hear. My father left in the truck without saying where he was going. He came back after midnight with a look she'd only seen once, the day his own father missed a step on a ladder. In the morning, before the casseroles, she saw him slip something into his shirt pocket. After Claire didn't show up, she watched him take the note out and read it to himself like he was testing whether words still meant what they used to. But that wasn't the part she'd been keeping. The part she'd been keeping was that 2 weeks later, after the return of the ring and the $67, my father went to Cincinnati. He told her he needed to pick up a special order for a client, which she knew was the kind of lie men tell when they want to protect you from the shape of a truth. He came back late and he was quiet for 3 days. The kind of quiet that sounds like someone repaired a clock and it now ran perfectly. She asked him then if he'd done something he couldn't undo. He said, "I kept my son alive." That was all he said. He never said it again. Part of me wanted to stand up and throw a chair through the window. Part of me wanted to ask my father's ghost if he remembered how I looked in that backyard, holding that note like a hot coin. But the bigger part wanted to know why. Why a man like him, who believed in square corners and receipts, would step into the middle of a love he didn't trust because love is messy and cash is clean. Mason helped me search. There are some gifts your kids bring you don't expect. Top among them is energy that doesn't care how many times you've said you're tired. He found a woman named Beth working at a clinic in Kettering, the same Beth who'd opened the door that night. We met her in the lobby, where the magazines were decades behind and the fish tank had fish that looked like they held grudges. She recognized me like you recognize a song after the first two notes. She put a hand to her mouth and then let it fall. She told us Claire had left that morning with a man who introduced himself as a friend of my father. He had a nose like it had broken once and healed better than it deserved. He brought a bus ticket and an envelope. He told Claire the man she had been afraid of wasn't just a bully with a toolbox anymore. He told her Eddie had gotten himself mixed up with some people who liked to carry knives that weren't for carving turkey. He said they had been in the alley behind the bowling lanes the night before. He said he'd heard what they'd planned for me, and it didn't include a honeymoon or a future. He said, "If you love him, you get on this bus and you don't call anyone." He said, "If you don't, then a man I know is going to bury his son." She cried and told Beth she wasn't brave enough to be a hero. Beth said sometimes the bravest thing is running when the story tells you to stay. Claire got on the bus. Beth didn't tell me because the man with the broken nose told her that telling me would be telling those other men too. She chose the quiet that kept me alive and tore me apart at the same time. You can hate someone for that and love them too. Both can be true. We asked her if she knew where Claire went. She said Indianapolis. After that, maybe Cincinnati, then maybe Louisville. Then a name she said like it was a secret you aren't supposed to say out loud. Elaine. She picked the name Elaine for herself because she said it looked like a good woman in a magazine ad for dish soap. Sometimes hiding is about disappearing, and sometimes it's about blending in so well the world forgets to look for you. It was Mason who found the next breadcrumb. He called one night, his voice careful, and said there was a woman named Elaine Atkins in a rental house 3 blocks from his own. She'd moved in a few months before, with a man named Rick, a retired trucker with bad knees and good jokes. She volunteered at the library's used book sale. She had the same birthday as Claire. It was absurd. It was impossible. It sounded like a trick the universe plays on you when it has nothing better to do. We agreed we wouldn't ambush anyone. We would act like people who had made mistakes and wanted to fix what could be fixed without breaking what had barely healed. Mason invited them to a neighborhood barbecue. I brought baked beans and the ring in my pocket because I have a bad sense of what to bring to anything. I saw her from across the yard and old air came back into my lungs. She wore her hair shorter and silver threaded through it, like someone had sketched winter with a pencil. She moved with the economy of someone who'd had to carry her own groceries across decades. When she saw Mason, she froze. Then she looked at me like you look at a photograph you thought you'd lost and just found behind a drawer. She didn't faint. This isn't that kind of story. She just set the potato salad on the picnic table and walked up to me and put her hand on my face like she was checking a fever. She said my name, and it was the same soft shape it had been through a closed door. We both laughed and we both cried. It felt like the world got very small and very clear. We took a walk down a quiet street lined with maples. For once in my life, I let someone else speak first. She told me she wanted to call 100 times, But the fear didn't diminish. It just learned to whisper. She said the man with the broken nose had found her a room near a church in Indianapolis, and after that a job in a diner that never asked for a last name. She said she'd found out she was pregnant 2 months after she left. She said she ate crackers and cried and grew a person out of her fear and her hope. She gave birth in Cincinnati in the fall, under a different name, and handed the baby to a couple who cried so hard the doctor told them to stop or he'd faint. She kept a flower from outside the hospital and the bus ticket the broken-nosed man had bought, and she wrote a note she hoped would find its way. And then she kept moving. I asked her about Eddie. She sighed. He didn't die, she said. He went to jail in '82 on a weapons charge. She heard that from a woman who came into the diner and liked to talk louder than her sense. When Claire found out, she almost called. But she pictured me with a wife and a baby and a calm life, and decided she wouldn't be the meteor that hit that planet. She got that wrong, and so did I. That was our specialty. We would have stood there saying everything and nothing until the streetlights came on. But then the man she'd come with, Rick, walked up smiling. He shook my hand like men who like to know how things are constructed. He called her Elaine, and she looked at me like a woman whose name has always had a small suitcase packed. She said, "Hank, this is my husband." It was like someone pulled a rug off a nail. I nodded because decency is a muscle, and if you don't use it when it matters, it atrophies. We had hot dogs and we avoided eye contact, and when I got home, I sat in my truck and listened to the engine tick as it cooled. I didn't sleep. I learned I still had that skill. The next morning there was a knock on my door. It was Claire. She held a thermos and 2 mugs like it was winter and not August. She said Rick was visiting his sister, and she had time to tell me something she didn't know how to put in a letter. She pulled a little metal key from her pocket and laid it in my palm. It had teeth like a crooked smile. I went cold. I took my own key out of the junk drawer and set it next to hers, and it was the same. She said he gave me 2. If one day you want to forgive me, he said, here's how. There was a storage locker off Route 4 that my father had rented under a fake last name. He told Broken Nose to tell Claire that the locker had things she might need if she ever wanted to start over. And if she ever wanted to tell me, she could use the second key because chance could be kind if you let it. We drove to the locker like we were teenagers breaking curfew. The place smelled like dust and regret. I turned the key and the door rolled up with a cough. Inside were 3 cardboard boxes and a rolled-up rug. In the first box, photos of me and my mother and my father, cut from duplicates so you couldn't tell which albums they'd come from. A note in my father's cramped hand that said, "If you ever show him, tell him I was trying to make a better mistake." In the second box, receipts for a bus ticket, for a room in Indianapolis, for a doctor in Cincinnati, all in my father's steady hand. In the third box, a stack of letters addressed to me, written in Claire's handwriting, never mailed. Dozens of them dated from 1981 to 1992. I sat on the concrete and read until my eyes, not my heart, refused. They were full of small details. The smell of a laundromat in November. The way a waitress in Louisville tucked stray hair behind her ear with the back of her hand. The first kick of a baby at 3:12 in the morning when the neon sign outside said rooms and only the M lit up. She wrote about the loneliness that comes from doing something right that looks wrong. She wrote the sentence I have lived on since. I left because love told me to stay and fear told me to run, and your father told me staying would put you in the ground. I didn't know which voice to trust, so I trusted all 3 and let them fight it out inside my body. She ended every letter the same way. Show up. Be decent. I love you. We sat there for a long time. Then she told me the last twist, the one she'd been holding because she didn't know if it was meant for me or for a priest or for nobody at all. Her husband, Rick, was good to her, and she was good to him. That was the truth. The other truth was less neat. She'd been forgetting small things. Keys, recipes, faces on the news. At first she made jokes, then she made lists, then she made an appointment. The doctor said the word nobody wants to hear. He said, "I'm sorry," a lot. He said early. He said the kind that walks you out of the life you built and leaves your shoes at the door. She said she came to Mason's barbecue because she didn't want to die as a woman who'd swallowed a story she should have spit out. She asked if I would forgive her. I told her forgiveness wasn't a switch. It was a door you had to keep your hand on so the wind didn't slam it. I told her I'd keep my hand there. After that day, I saw her often. Not secretly, not the way the movies would like. With dignity, with appointments, with lists. We went to the farmer's market and bought peaches too soft to survive the ride home. We sat on a bench near the reservoir and counted boats with names we liked. She told me things she'd kept, and I told her the ways the years had made me kinder and also smaller. I met Rick without flinching. He'd been a long-haul man for so many years, his sense of time had different mile markers. He loved her in his way, and I loved her in mine, and we both decided not to make that a war. Mason came by with his son and a plastic dinosaur, and we tried to weave something that hadn't existed because we hadn't known it could. We had Thanksgiving early that year because that's what you do when you don't know how many you've got. She sat at my table between me and my mother, who brought the good towels out and dangled grace like a thread we all could hold. Time did what it does. It didn't care about whether our story was neat. It took her quick and it took her slow. The months got slippery. She forgot my last name, and then she remembered it and then disappeared it again, like a coin trick you're not laughing at anymore. There were days when she could look at a photo of Mason as a boy and tell you exactly how his face turned toward light. There were other days when she stared out the window and said she hoped the azaleas would bloom like they did in that backyard wedding she never made it to. She started calling me sweetheart, which can be a word for anyone. But sometimes at dusk she'd look right at me and say Hank the way she did when the door was closed. In her last week, she asked to go for a drive. We went past All-Star Lanes, which had closed and reopened and closed again. We went by the house where my parents had lived, now painted a color my mother would have argued with. We drove out to that strip near Old Troy Pike where the planes come in low. A small one dipped close enough you could see the pilot's hands on the controls. She reached for mine, and we sat there with all that weight in the sky above us, flying and humming and not falling. She said, "Tell me the story." So I told it to her the way I'm telling it to you. I told her about the bowling balls rolling like planets. I told her about the ring in the freezer like a connection waiting out a storm. I told her about the key in the locker and the letters and the line about better mistakes. I told her we had a son who was kind and funny and kept plastic dinosaurs in his shoes. She cried a little, and then she fell asleep to the sound of a sky that doesn't care about human plans. When I brought her home, Rick met us at the door, and I handed her to him the way you hand a heavy thing to someone who knows how to carry it. She died on a Tuesday when the weather had the decency to be modest about it. No drama, just a soft day that tilted toward evening. At her service, which felt too small for the life she had dragged across the map, I put the ring in her hand. I didn't make a speech. I didn't confess to a church full of people who didn't need what I had. I stood beside a man who had loved her for a long time, and beside a son I almost didn't know. And we did the one thing love always asks when the story ends. We showed up. We were decent. A month later, I went back to the storage locker and sat on the concrete and read the letters again. I took them home and put them in a shoebox under my workbench. The ring was gone now, where it should be. The key went back in the junk drawer, where it could rattle against screws and pennies and pieces you keep in case you ever figure out what they belong to. I drove to the backyard of my old house and parked across the street like a thief. The azaleas had given up years ago, but there was a stubborn little bush near the corner that looked like it might try again next spring. I forgave my father out loud. It felt strange, and it felt right. He'd made a choice, and he'd made it in a way I didn't approve of. He also saved me from a thing I can't imagine. He loved me in his language. I thought about all the men who say I love you by fixing a hinge. I thought maybe we should teach our sons both forms. Say it and fix the hinge. So here's what I know now, after all of it. Love is not a straight road. It's a series of turns where the signposts are half torn down. Sometimes the person you choose disappears because choosing you would mean sending you into a kind of storm you don't survive. Sometimes the man you think can only swing a hammer also knows how to move a life quietly from one city to another without breaking it, even if he breaks you. Sometimes the son you didn't know you had walks into a diner and orders pancakes, and you look at his hands and think, there I am. We don't get clean stories. We get stories with dents in them. If you're lucky, you get to tell yours before your memory smears the ink. I kept my promise to Claire. I showed up. I was decent, even when I didn't want to be. That's what I'm trying to do here with you. I tell you these things not because I like to hurt in public, but because I've learned secrets are mildew. They grow in the dark and ruin what they touch. Air and sun won't fix everything, but they help. If you're still with me, thank you. This one went long and it went crooked. If it hit you where you live, do me a favor. Subscribe to Mind-Blowing Stories. We are trying to get that 96% of wonderful lurkers to come in from the porch. Hit that button. Like the video if it meant something. Tell me in the comments if you ever found someone you loved after you thought the door had closed for good. I read them. I answer when I can. And if you're the kind of person who needs a line to carry into tomorrow, take the one Claire gave me, and I'll give it to you exactly the way she wrote it. Show up. Be decent. I love you for trying.